I was stunned, frankly, to hear in the ABC special one of the scholars' interviews suggest that the earliest disciples may have been prompted to come to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead because of Greco-Roman myths about dying and rising gods. And the reason I was surprised, you see, is because this was a hypothesis that was bandied about in the so-called history of religions school of thought back at the close of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. But the school soon collapsed and has been virtually universally given up today among New Testament scholars. So that the idea that the disciples came to believe in the resurrection of Jesus on the basis of Greco-Roman myths is simply obsolete. Generally, New Testament scholars today recognize that the proper framework for understanding Jesus of Nazareth is not Greco-Roman mythology, but rather it is first century Palestinian Judaism. And it is against the background of Judaism that the prophet from Nazareth is properly to be understood. And the whole movement of the Jewish reclamation of Jesus, of understanding the Jewishness of Jesus, is testimony to this fact. Now, why did that history of religion school collapse? Well, primarily two reasons. Number one, the parallels were spurious. In fact, there are no parallels to the resurrection narratives or the empty tomb narratives in Greco-Roman mythology. These dying and rising gods did not concern historical figures at all. They were merely mythological symbols of the crop cycle. The crops dry up and die in the hot, arid Mideastern summer, and then they come back to life when the winter and spring rains come. And it wasn't thought at all that these were applied to historical individuals. Indeed, really, they didn't concern resurrections at all. These gods like Tammuz and Adonis and Osiris didn't really return to life, didn't really come back to life from the dead. They still existed in the afterlife, so that it's really a complete misnomer to think of these as parallel to the empty tomb and appearance narratives and the belief in the resurrection of Jesus. But secondly, there's no causal connection between these myths and the earliest disciples. You see, these myths were known in Judaism, and Jews found them utterly abhorrent. They were blasphemous to Orthodox Jews. And the idea that the earliest disciples of Jesus would sincerely come to believe that Jesus of Nazareth was risen from the dead because they had heard these myths about Osiris and Adonis and Hercules is as absurd as you're coming to believe that some friend of yours is risen from the dead because you saw the movie E.T. and E.T. came back to life in the movie. It's just historically absurd to think that these men would sincerely have come to believe Jesus was risen from the dead on the basis of these myths and then be willing to go to tortuous deaths in attestation to the truth of that belief.
And it certainly wouldn't explain James and Paul.
Well, that's exactly right, because these unbelievers like James, Paul, were not believers in Jesus when they saw these appearances.
Thomas.
Exactly.